In maritime labor disputes, the procedural history of a case can reveal a significant gap between initial interpretations of the law and the final word. In Hisanza versus Bright Maritime Corporation, the initial regional arbitration branch awarded an injured seafarer $7,465. Years later, the Supreme Court of the Philippines ordered the employer to pay $60,000. The physical facts are straightforward. Seafarer Adan Hisanza slipped and fell on the deck of a bulk carrier, suffering a spinal injury that required months of physical therapy and medication. After 190 days of treatment, the company-designated physician issued a progress report. The employer used this specific document to halt further medical coverage and offered Hisanza a partial disability payout corresponding to a grade 11 rating. Hisanza rejected the offer. He consulted an independent orthopedic specialist who assessed him at a grade 3 disability, prompting the seafarer to file a formal complaint demanding full permanent disability benefits. The initial labor tribunals, the RAB, the National Labor Relations Commission, and the Court of Appeals, all dismissed Hisanza's claim. They reasoned that when a company doctor and a private doctor disagree, the seafarer is obligated to initiate a referral to a neutral third doctor. Hisanza had not done this. 3 separate appellate bodies concluded the seafarer had forfeited his claim. It was a plausible reading of the standard contract, but it relied on an incorrect assumption about exactly where the burden of proof lay at that moment. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the justices reversed the unanimous findings of the lower labor tribunals. They determined the error in this dispute had nothing to do with Hisanza missing a third doctor referral. The true legal mechanism hinged on the employer. Bright Maritime failed to issue a legally definitive medical assessment of the seafarer's condition within the required statutory timeframe. The error was traced to the report issued on day 190. The employer relied on a document explicitly labeled interim to justify ending the seafarer's medical care before his treatment was complete. Terminating medical coverage based on a provisional assessment legally transforms a partial physical disability into a total permanent disability by operation of law. The employment of Filipino seafarers is governed by the POEEA Standard Employment Contract. Section 20A mandates that if a seafarer is injured, the employer must provide medical care and assess the worker's fitness to return to duty. This timeline shows the initial window the contract provides. The employer is given 120 days to resolve the medical condition. If the seafarer requires further medical attention, the employer can extend this timeline to 240 days. Before that clock runs out, the employer must fulfill an obligation. They must either declare the seafarer fully fit to work or establish a definitive degree of permanent disability. The Supreme Court applies a strict standard to this declaration. It must be final, conclusive, and definitive. An assessment is legally void if it is tentative, provisional, or indicates that the physician still requires further medical action to reach a conclusion. This timeline is not a flexible medical guideline. It is a strict legal countdown where documentary ambiguity creates liability for the employer. To understand the failure, examine the December 5th medical report. Issued on day 190, 50 days remained in the treatment period. Labeled 10th Progress Report, it is an ongoing log, not a final determination. The physician explicitly writes, "Physical therapy is continued." This sentence confirms that medical treatment was not exhausted and the seafarer had not been officially discharged. Finally, the doctor provides a rating, writing, "In the interim, an interim disability grade of 11 is given." The Supreme Court ruled that because the document used the word interim, it was, by definition, procedurally incomplete. Labeling a document interim while using it to end an employee's medical coverage creates a procedural contradiction that leads to liability in maritime law. The employer's error was treating an explicitly interim medical report as if it were a final assessment. This internal declaration was used to stop Hisanza's ongoing physical therapy and medication prematurely. By stopping care before a definitive assessment was reached, the employer breached its obligations under Section 20A of the contract. When an employer stops treatment and let the 240-day clock expire without a valid final assessment, the law triggers a mechanism called ipso jure. Under this rule, the law imposes a conclusive presumption of total permanent disability as a penalty. entirely bypassing the actual physical state of the injury. This flowchart illustrates the standard dispute mechanism. It settled disagreements between a company's doctor and a seafarer's private physician through a neutral third doctor. The lower tribunals assumed that issuing any medical grade shifted the burden to the seafarer to initiate this referral process. The Supreme Court clarified that the third doctor rule is only activated if the company physician's initial assessment is legally definitive. Because an interim assessment is legally non-existent as a final determination, there was no valid company assessment for the seafarer to formally dispute. With no valid assessment to dispute, the seafarer had no duty to find a third doctor. The employer lost by default. This comparison shows the physical medical reality of the case. The company doctor issued a grade 11 rating, and the seafarer's own doctor issued a grade 3. Note the paradox. Not a single medical professional, not even Hisanza's chosen specialist, diagnosed him as totally and permanently disabled, which requires a grade 1. Despite those clinical findings, the Supreme Court applied a legal rating of grade 1, guaranteeing the maximum payout. This outcome highlights how maritime labor law prioritizes strict compliance with statutory assessment periods over the clinical extent of a physical injury. Physical medical reality yields to legal procedure when statutory safeguards are ignored. For maritime employers and legal practitioners, the rule in Hisanza is clear. Procedural exactness dictates liability. An interim assessment is strictly a tool for tracking progress and updating internal departments. Using an interim report to justify denying further mandated treatment is an administrative error that the Supreme Court has consistently penalized. Shortcutting the statutory clock with provisional documents will reliably result in a judgment for total and permanent disability. This procedural miscalculation ultimately cost Bright Maritime Corporation a staggering $60,000, plus interest and attorney's fees. Within the POEA standard employment contract, a medically sound but legally incomplete report is the most expensive document an employer can ever sign.